At the Battle of Midway, Japan lost 4 carriers in a decisive American victory. But that isn't the whole story. America lost 2 carriers as well, but it could have been even more because one was almost sunk by a lucky hit and another suffered catastrophic damage, which nearly led to its sinking and which may have had serious consequences. For the war, most people don't know about these 2 American carriers because they were never told. This is the untold story of the American carrier that almost sank at the Battle of Midway and the cover-up that followed. Midway was fought over 4 days between June and June 1942. It would be remembered as one of the most decisive battles of the Pacific War. But how did Japan lose 4 carriers and why is this significant? Well, prior to Midway, the Japanese Navy had 6 fleet carriers. They were large flat-top ships designed to launch aircraft that could then attack enemy ships or land-based targets from miles away. These carriers were formidable and arguably ahead of their time, and so losing only one would be a serious blow. Losing 4, however, would effectively end Japan's ability to conduct carrier warfare, and that is exactly what happened at Midway. During the battle, Japanese bombers launched from their 4 carriers struck and sank the American aircraft carrier USS Yorktown, as well as causing significant damage to the American carriers Enterprise and Hornet, but Japan didn't know that. To them, they believed that they had only sunk 1 American carrier and damaged another. What they didn't realize was that Yorktown had survived for over 24 hours after being hit by a bomb, and during that time her crew had managed to repair her enough to get her underway. However, while underway, a torpedo hit her, causing her to sink just 2 hours later. But why am I telling you all this? Well, the reason is that Japan thought they had only sunk 1 American carrier, which meant that they had actually won a tactical victory. If they had known the truth, the consequences for Japan could have been disastrous. Why? Well, if Japan knew that they had sunk 3 out of 4 American carriers, then the admiral commanding the Japanese fleet, Mikawa, might have called off the attack on Midway at all. He may have realized that his force was too depleted to take on the remaining American carrier and any further attacks might result in even greater losses. However, since he thought that the Americans only had 1 carrier left, he pressed home his advantage and attacked Midway. But this proved to be a critical mistake. You see, Midway was defended by just 150 aircraft, which meant that for every Japanese plane that was shot down, there were fewer and fewer defenders to shoot down. The next wave of Japanese attackers, in other words, the Japanese Navy had made a fatal error. They thought they had won a major victory when really they had lost the battle. It was this myth that they had sunk 3 American carriers that also led to Japan continuing to attack Midway when they should have known that the island was no longer viable as a naval base. This meant that they wasted precious fuel and resources attacking a target that could no longer be used as a base. So the question is, why didn't anyone tell Japan that they had actually lost 4 carriers? Well, the answer lies with the surviving American carriers, specifically 1 carrier, Enterprise. When Enterprise arrived at Midway, she found the sea littered with debris from the previous day's battle. Life rafts, lifeboats, planes, bombs, everything. And in the middle of all this, she found 3 living Japanese airmen. They were rescued and taken aboard Enterprise where they were interrogated, but they couldn't speak English. And the men on board Enterprise couldn't speak Japanese. Therefore, communication was difficult to say the least. Despite this, the Japanese airmen were able to convey that they had come from the Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soru. But then something interesting happened. The 3 Japanese sailors tried to make it clear that they were the only survivors from these ships. They repeatedly indicated that their 3 carriers had been sunk and that there were no other Japanese ships nearby. In fact, they gestured that there were no other Japanese ships for miles. Now, why they did this, we can only guess. Perhaps they were trying to protect the whereabouts of their main fleet, which was still intact and hiding nearby. Or perhaps they genuinely believed that their 3 carriers had been sunk and that they were the only survivors. Either way, the Enterprise crew jumped to the conclusion that these 3 Japanese sailors were all that was left of the Japanese carrier force, and therefore they decided to hold a victory celebration as soon as word got back to the mainland that Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soru had been sunk. The American public went wild. Newspapers ran front pages celebrating the massive victory. Politicians gave speeches extolling the bravery of the men who had fought at Midway, and President Roosevelt gave the order for Enterprise to continue with her regular patrol, even though she was critically short of both fuel and aircraft. The problem was that Enterprise didn't have enough fuel to return to Pearl Harbor. She was over 1,000 miles away from the nearest port, and if she ran out of fuel, she'd be sitting prey to Japanese submarines and long-range bombers. Therefore, her best option was to head towards a small atoll called Palmyra, which was over 600 miles away. But before she could set sail, she needed fuel. Fortunately, 2 submarines were close by and they were able to transfer enough fuel for Enterprise to reach Palmyra, but that's when things took a turn for the worse. A few hours into the journey, a Japanese submarine appeared out of nowhere and fired a spread of torpedoes at Enterprise. Luckily, all 5 missed, but not before causing catastrophic damage to her rudder control system. Now, without functional rudders, Enterprise could no longer steer herself. Her only option was to drift towards the nearest port, which happened to be Japanese-occupied Truk. Now, normally, this wouldn't be a problem. All Enterprise had to do was turn on her engines and head in the opposite direction, but she couldn't do this because she was now severely damaged and drifting dangerously off course. She could either try and reach Wake Island, which was over 800 miles away, or she could try and reach Truk, which was just 370 miles away. Unfortunately, Enterprise was critically short of fuel and she couldn't make the journey to Wake, so the decision was made to head to Truk, but this put Enterprise in a very precarious situation. You see, when Enterprise had been rescuing those 3 Japanese sailors, she had inadvertently given away the location of the entire American fleet. That information had reached Tokyo and the Japanese were now expecting an American fleet to arrive at Truk at any moment. This meant that Enterprise was essentially sailing right into a trap. Luckily, the Japanese weren't aware that Enterprise was severely damaged and they assumed that she would put up a fight. This meant that they moved their ships away from Truk, which allowed Enterprise to slip past them undetected. But her ordeal was far from over. For the next 5 days, she drifted closer and closer to the Japanese, held territory until finally reaching the safety of a friendly port. By the time she arrived, she was critically short of fuel and barely had enough power to move her from adrift. Had the Japanese known that she was damaged, they could have easily sunk her and dealt a massive blow to the Americans, but they didn't, and therefore the true extent of America's victory at Midway was never truly realized. In fact, it wasn't until 1985 that the full story of the battle was declassified and the American public learned that their sailors had achieved an even greater victory than they had previously thought. Even today, very little is known about what happened to those 3 Japanese airmen after they were rescued from the ocean. Some believe that they were executed for spying, while others believe that they were simply sent back to Japan. What is known, however, is that without their intervention, Enterprise may not have made it out of the Pacific alive. If you enjoyed this video, then check out my other content. Thanks for watching.